Hi, Magda. Oh my God,
Hi,
it's so
Margaret.
exciting to have you here with us today. We haven't spoken in a minute. A good-
Yes, it's been a full 3-year term lease.
Has it been that long?
It absolutely has been that long.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah, it has been.
Well,
It's
well,
unfortunate
COVID,
because you're like a sister, so it's always good to
for
see you.
sure, for sure. But COVID has brought us back together, it seems, and having these discussions. Where are you right now? Where are you physically?
I'm physically in Miami, Florida, in the United States, and living through the pandemic from the American perspective is quite an interesting ride.
Yeah, there are a lot of crazy things going on in the US with your president.
Indeed, you know that he announced this morning he wants to suspend the U.S.'s contributions to the
Just,
WHO.
I
It's
know.
outrageous and clearly an opportunity to deflect attention from the poor response that Mr. Trump and his administration has administered here in the U.S. And so, unfortunately, the tactic will not work. However, he does have, and I say it will not work because the media and the public is well aware of his failings and his administration's failings at the national level because we're living it every day. Healthcare workers don't have what they need. People in the US are lining up to get food only a month out from the original. Yes, we have millions
Wow.
lining up to get food because where there is no income and maybe people used to buy their food, now they don't have income to buy it. Or if they don't know how to cook and they're used to eating out and they don't have income, now they can't go out to eat. So those things have put a lot of strain on the system, and we're seeing those images in the news, so we know that there are a lot of failings. Nonetheless, he is able, as the chief of the United States, to issue executive orders, and through his executive order, he has indeed suspended funding for a 60 to
Crazy,
90-day period until a review
crazy,
is completed
crazy.
as to whether or not they should continue.
And let me tell you, I'm so excited to have this conversation with you. I know we only have about 35 minutes, but because of what we're seeing your president, and I'm calling him your president, doing in the context of trade. And you are, one of the experts globally that I look up to, I respect. When you speak on matters of global trade, I listen and I pay attention.
Oh, thank
And you recently wrote an article on trade in the context, trade policy, trade issues arising in the context of COVID. What 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 are you thinking when you see your president, uh, intervening on transactions where people in countries have paid for PPE and emergency supplies and saying no, the US can do it. What is your thinking around that? Also, you understand our global trade system. How is he able to do that? I really want you to break down for the average listener, because I know the average listener might be thinking, but we have a World Trade Organization. We're supposed to have free trade agreements. How is he able to do that? And apparently without consequence so far.
Well, Margaret, the reality is there will be consequences, of course. The question is whether they'll be legal, political, or otherwise.
Right.
In the context of international trade law is, in fact, really largely based on the acquiescence of one country to another. In other words, agreements between countries. And those agreements can be broken with consequences or can be broken in ways that affect the general public. What's happening, yes, we have a World Trade Organization, and yes, there are these international trade agreements, but countries have to have the will to participate and to give teeth to the enforcement of those agreements. So in the case of Mr. Trump's actions, it is a totalitarian overreach, no question about it. In the US, there is supposed to be a system of checks and balances that makes it impossible for the executive, Mr. Trump in this case, to have a reach that affects the global stage in the way that he has, without the legislative and the judiciary balancing him out. But unfortunately, he's appointed 3 of the 9 justices. We have a number of Republicans in the Congress who outweigh the Democrats in the House. They outweigh them in the Senate, who are siding with Mr. Trump and allowing him to move forward on legislative actions in ways that, if we had a better balance of power in the Congress and in the Supreme Court, they would have been able to stop. Unfortunately, that's not what we're seeing, and those actions are a reach. Further, the U.S. is a major donor on the international stage and has a lot of influence. So whereas, and I wrote an article about this years ago about how U.S. sanctions can kill your deal, because if the U.S. decides that it wants to intervene on your international contract and the way that you do business, it in fact has the power to do so simply by withholding funds, in much the same way that Mr. Trump has decided to do with the World Health Organization, sadly.
Yeah, but this thing about seizing goods that are, en route via a contract, I find it unprecedented.
It is unprecedented, Margaret, but you saw that Justin Trudeau, when it happened in Canada, did not decide to pursue action against the U.S. So this, in fact, held a press conference where he said he was not going to pursue action against the U.S. So this emphasizes, again, my point about the countries being willing to put teeth behind the laws and the actions. Canada has absolutely the right to go before the WTO and bring a case against the United States.
Right.
One, even if it did, though, the U.S. is withholding appointments of judges to the court, to the policy body at the WTO that would, in fact, be able to decide those cases. So right now, that body is without any teeth to make any important decisions.
And this is what we're finding in so many of our global institutions, because I think their power structure is based on the nation state, and the nation state appointing representatives to these global institutions, the UN, the WTO, the IMF, all of these international institutions. And human beings might be thinking, oh, these organizations are going to look after the collective agenda properly. No, they just seem to be an extension of nation-state governance. Whatever the nation-state position is, they are going to find the ways around the agreements at the global level to be able to push their will. So
we saw that with Nikki Haley, for example's appointment to the UN. But I have to say, though, the WHO, interestingly enough, is one of the organizations that's different from that.
That's what I saw.
The largest funder at the WHO is the United States, but the second largest is a philanthropic organization, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. And so, interestingly and paradoxically, this one organization that has not only nation-state representation, but also philanthropic representation from the private sector, finds itself being held hostage to supplement Trump's inadequacies in the way that he's responded to this virus. So yes, you're right that many of the other international organizations have this nation state face that they must present. But in fact, the WHO sets a precedence for what should be done. There should be more philanthropic involvement at these organizations. And
you're triggering me. You're triggering me.
Yes, I'm triggering you because
she's triggering me. You know why she's triggering me? You know why she's triggering me with the Bill Gates. Yeah,
I'm having a very provocative question.
Yes.
So since the WHO was actually kind of financially supported by the US and by this philanthropic organization that is led by Bill and
stop triggering me. Stop triggering me.
Okay, so my question is, usually whomever the founder is or whomever provides the financial support also kind of provides a direction into where should the organization go and how the organization should actually deal with the issues at hand. So could we now say that those who financially supported the whole thing and who were the founders of WHO were not actually providing enough directions, or were not really being actively involved in how we are dealing with the viruses and stuff. Is it really that this is solely the responsibility of the organization, or is the founders and the financial supporters as well? Because it sounds to me quite a lot like that.
Well, what I can tell you is the WHO, along with the World Bank and the other, the IMF and other kind of international dominant organizations, were all created out of the Marshall Plan post-World War II. Mm-hmm. So this is an organization that's been around since the 1940s. And there's no question that the major funding or country, nation states of the organization do in fact have some weight in the direction in which the organization goes. Nonetheless, the reality is that nation states are supposed to, regardless of their nation state contributions, they're supposed to have equal voting rights in these organizations, with the exception of the Security Council at the UN, made up of 5 nations, the U.S., France, China, Russia, and I forget the 5th one, but with the UK, exactly, thank you. With the exception of those, of that body, all of the other organizations are supposed to have equal weight. The nation states are supposed to have equal weight in the decision making of the organization. And in fact, they agree on voting who will be the leaders of those organizations, and countries that have felt that traditionally their voices have not been listened to have been advocating for many years to have more power and more responsibility, which is in fact how you ended up seeing an Ethiopian doctor at the head of WHO.
Right. So these are the power dynamics that we are.
These are the power dynamics that have been changing over the last decade, I would say, where countries that have felt that they are contributing to these organizations, but are not getting the representation that they feel they should be having, or not having the influence that they should be having, are saying, no, wait a minute, I'm contributing. My taxpayers are also contributing. I want to say. And so you're now seeing at the heads of many international organizations, UNCTAD's head is also from Africa, from the African continent. So you have a whole different dynamic going on than you did, let's say, up until the end of the 20th century. The beginning of the 21st century has seen a change in dynamic, but it's slow. It is slow, and there's still much work to be done.
So what happens next? I mean, now Trump has withdrawn. I mean, we've seen that pattern so many times already. There's been like Paris Agreement and Trump withdrew from that. So, you know, no whatsoever global policy with regard to climate change. Okay, now the WHO, is that like a new pattern that we can just get used to, or how do we run the world then?
I don't know if it's a pattern that we should get used to, because the November elections will tell us what the U.S. will look like. But one thing's for sure is that the United States has decided that it wants to go rogue, as I put it. It wants to go its own way. And so on the international stage, where people have traditionally turned to the United States as a superpower, even though that nomener is no longer really accurate, I think that the dynamic now requires other countries and regions, emerging regions, for example, Southeast Asia and Asia Pacific, to perhaps come in and say, hey, in the past, we've taken a back seat and allowed this leadership because the U.S. has been a major donor. If the U.S. isn't going to play by the rules, we're going to play by the rules, and we're going to collectively act to replace the vacuum that the U.S. has left. That is what countries, I think, will need to do as they look towards their next steps, given the U.S.'s actions, policy actions over the last few years, particularly since this administration has been in place.
And, you know, we're also seeing a shortage all around the world of PPE and emergency supplies that are required. And we're seeing governments, well, Trump, blocking the passage of this through the international challenge to countries. How do you see this playing out within the next couple months or so, as we continue, as the demand for this equipment continues to rise, and what's the state of play in the world in terms of the countries that are producing it and all of that? I know you have some thoughts around that.
Thanks, Margaret. There are a couple of things I want to say about that. Number one, I do a little bit of work with clients who are looking to be connected from suppliers to distributors to buyers. And what I'm seeing in that area, strangely, is even producers, global production suppliers in the China or Asia region, even they, where most of our textiles are coming from, are running low on raw materials. Or you might see, in the case of France, French-speaking or Francophone countries turning to France. Very strange dynamics, unprecedented. These are independent nations who are trying to use their influence on the international market to get the things that they need. And unfortunately, they're having a lot of difficulty. And so they're using the purchasing power of nations that have more financial wherewithal to help them get access to those goods. And that's the only way really that they're going to be able to get that access, because I can tell you small island states, for example, would have difficulty fighting the U.S. or Canada if it were, up to, if it came down to an order that was for one or the other. So instead of doing it alone, they're either going through regional organizations or global organizations like the ones I mentioned, or they're aligning, interestingly enough, with former colonial partners, or powers rather, to help them gain access to those goods. Very, very unusual times.
So what you're saying is pretty much that the COVID-19 is showing us just how much sovereignty we actually have. I mean, there's almost none of it. Speaking for my own country, we are small enough to not really rely on our own production. We will always be in some sort of a dependency. But what you're mentioning, like the third element, very clearly show that there is still a lot of strings attached to all the previous colonial powers. And that's amazing. I mean, I thought that we have progressed quite a lot, but not as much as we actually maybe should. I mean, that's a strong statement. Maybe that's a good thing to kind of have that type of a connection, but
I don't know, Anya. What I do know, though, is that the countries who are making those requests to the former colonial powers certainly don't see it that way. They see it more as a partnership. These relationships have been built over the last, 50 years. In the case of some countries that got their independence a little earlier, and so 50, 60 years. And so they see the fact that they're reaching out to these former powers as a partnership and not as a subordinate relationship. So you do have that aspect. The other thing that you have now is, for a long time in the supply chain, and Margaret can speak to this as well, what you used to have was just in time. So just in time supply meant that you only produced what you needed at the time. It comes from a philosophy developed by the Toyota Motor Company, actually, in Japan, where goods were manufactured only as the orders came in and then shipped out. But just in case, which is the former way we used to do things, is going to be adopted by more and more countries. Why? Because countries have realized that they're standing in the middle of a storm with no protection. They have no supplies, even if they wanted to. They've shut down factories that used to produce the goods that they needed. So now you're going to see countries saying, wait a minute, let's put a break on globalization and global production chains. Let's create our own national stockpiles, and we will find a way to fund that, where they didn't used to want to fund it before. They always thought it was too expensive. They will now say, let's find a way to fund keeping our own national stockpile, and let's make sure that we never find ourselves in this situation again. More draconian countries or measures might be taken by certain countries that are more totalitarian, where they say, no, let's nationalize one or two or X number of companies, and those companies will provide what we need in the time of need. This is, in the case of the United States, Trump was asked to invoke the Defense Powers Act to do just that. He refused, and then when he finally did, he's directed it to a specific company, General Motors, for them to do that, and that was unprecedented as well. So you will see a number of dynamics shifting, not the three I mentioned previously, but this fourth one too, which is national stockpiles and having just in case reserves. in case we find ourselves in this position later on. Because don't forget, even if we are able to reopen businesses, schools, and allow individuals to go outside gradually, the reality is this virus may come back in much the same way that we've seen Asian countries dealing with it after they've closed and reopened.
Yeah, and thinking about food supply as well. I mean, I think we will see, and I think we've started to see some agitation in the Caribbean and in other smaller states saying, sorry, this Ricardian model of comparative advantage, and we are just going to produce this to export, and we're going to import all of our food and all that sort of thing. Trinidad and Tobago, massive exporter of oil and gas and overly reliant. Very, very, our economy is based on that.
Absolutely. You've promoted for a long time that diversification was needed.
Yeah, and so maybe we're going to see countries recognizing now that diversification is critical, and that we need to deploy resources to build food resiliency, within nation states. So what do you think about that? Because I think we go to school and we've been taught a lot about economic theory. And I know the whole international trade system has been influenced by Ricardian theory, and that theory of competitive advantage, which I came across. I'm a lawyer. I did economics at A levels. But when I began to specialize in public procurement, you cannot help but see the connections between public procurement and economics and trade and all of that. And so I came across them within the last 20 years, right? And initially, my initial was like, really? Really? Because it makes a lot of assumptions, doesn't it? It makes a lot of assumptions about, that the market is going to be liberal, completely liberal and free and easy and all of that. And then it leaves countries very vulnerable and dependent, and so are we going to see, do you think, a stepping back from the kind of way you get in a room with these economists and all of that, and you're just schooled, this is the only way it must be? I wonder if we are going to see going forward a more pluralistic approach to economic theory, opening up of different kinds of ideas, and that it might be okay for a country to focus on feeding their people first, using their resources to enhance their own quality of life first, across the board. Take care of your geographic area, then in terms of access, looking to export. I don't know. What do you think?
I think, Margaret, you may have hit it on the nose and laid it out as well as I would have, if not better. The reality is those conversations are already being had. If you start to look at the kind of regional or national newspapers in some of the regions that are not mainstream media focused, you start to see that people are already writing and talking and discussing. Governments are already talking about doing this. Question will be really, how is that going to be done? Which governments will focus on what? Because there are areas where, simply food security, for example, as one issue, there are countries that simply aren't able to provide for their populations, even if they wanted to grow certain fruits and vegetables and meat products. So you are going to see people turning inward, having a discussion about how to secure, first and foremost, their food supply, and then secondly, looking at how to diversify their economies. You come from a country, Trinidad and Tobago, that has long been criticized for focusing way too much on the extractive industries. And now we're seeing with oil barreling down to $2 a barrel, something like that, and OPEC cutting production. All of a sudden, all of those who have been saying for so many years, please diversify, you must diversify. These are the areas you should diversify into: technology, the blue economy, food production, etc. All of those are now coming back to the forefront and saying, hey, maybe we should have listened to these people because it made sense. And so so there's already that turning beginning to happen, I think, in the collective mindset. Now, the question is, in terms of policy, are we going to see it? And if we don't see it, I feel that people were going to need to push for that. Citizens are going to have to engage and push their governments to give them that kind of policy support. And when I say policy support, I'm talking about subsidies, I'm talking about training, I'm talking about putting into frameworks where governments can exchange with one another, but where individuals can exchange with one another. There are countries that have access to advanced seeding, for example, that they can share with other countries and help crops, managing of, I saw the other day in BBC that there's a virus going around in the olive trees in Europe, and it could potentially cost billions and devastate the olive supply. So there's no question that we're going to need to make access to food, number one, a priority, but also pluralize or move to a pluralistic view of economic theory that gets rid of this idea is I have the competitive advantage. You grow bananas, I grow, a yucca, and so I'll send you a yucca and you send me all your bananas and have none left for your people. That makes no sense. However, there's the power dynamics that led to that kind of thinking are still in place. The reality is countries that are traditionally less economically advanced, countries that are dependent on nation states around them that may be bigger. For example, in the Caribbean, countries are extremely dependent on the U.S., on Canada. So you might want to see those countries taking a more regional focus to try to bring into their policy framework ways that will make sure that these kinds of monolithic ways of looking at trade and global production are eliminated, and they can focus on making sure their persons, their people, their populations have what's needed. In fact, that's what Mr. Trump started with his whole America First idea, but it was America first at the expense of others. And that's something we don't want to see. We want other countries to have market access and to be able to feed their peoples as any other country should.
I love how you put that. I love that balance.
I was perhaps too passionate about it, but it is something that really touches my heart because my family is from Haiti, as you know, and is always described as one of the poorest countries in the Western Hemisphere. But I can tell you that Haiti has all of the fruits and vegetables that it needs. What it doesn't have is the opportunity to transport them over good roads or distribution lines to the rest of the Caribbean or the rest of the world, primarily because its main trading partner is the United States, and the United States wishes to control how those goods move about. And when you have quote unquote donor countries going to Haiti, and in fact, contracts are awarded to those same donor countries.
I know. Don't start me. We need to have a whole conversation
on Haiti, about that. Right.
On Haiti and the decimation of their industries, with the dumping of goods. Haiti used to produce all its rice. I've read on that. It's just, don't start.
Right.
There's so much, and you are such, I think, a powerful articulator of these issues from a global South perspective, which is why I always connect with you, and we've done so much work together in the Caribbean. And I think it's so important that our voices in some of these spaces can be heard. Just a couple of things, because I know we are short on time. I did want to raise an issue with you about price gouging, because we're seeing a lot of price gouging all over the place. I had one of our colleagues on this show a little while ago, a few days ago, and he was trying to make the case to me, and Anya was there, so Anya can correct me if I'm misquoting, but he's trying to make the case to me that we should not be focusing on price gouging at all. And in fact, it's quite stupid to do so, because if we were to do so, we're going to chase the suppliers away. And
Absolutely not. Absolutely not.
That he actually said those words. And then I saw there was a follow-up webinar recently where he showed a picture of someone in their garage with loads of PPE equipment and loads of stuff that was needed.
Gentleman.
And someone was telling him about the whole thing, and he asked the question, well, should we have not dealt with him? What would we have done if we held him for price gouging? Wouldn't we have lost all of that? And basically saying we are at the supplier's behest, mercy in this situation. I was wondering whether I was going mad, so I actually want to just ask another colleague about price gouging in the time of COVID-19. What's your view on it, on price gouging?
Okay, well, let's be very clear. Price gouging is fraud.
Thank you.
It's fraudulent activity, and it is corrupt to engage in it. Not just legally, it's corrupt morally to engage in that in a time when people are in great need. So with regard to the example, for example, that was shared with you with the gentleman in the U.S. having hoarded millions of dollars worth of hand sanitizer. He went around multiple states at the beginning of the epidemic, before it was even declared as a pandemic, and collected all of this material and then tried to sell it at not double the cost, but in some cases 10 times the cost, 100 times the cost. And that's what price gouging is. It's not making a small profit because we're able to collect some goods and then resell them at a profit. We're talking about exploitative processes, exploiting a price at the expense of another that you know is in need. So there's no question that that is wrong and that should not be tolerated. And in fact, that gentleman was prosecuted. The goods were seized and redistributed to persons in need, which is what should happen. So I've seen price gouging not just in the U.S. where I am right now, but also in the Caribbean where I have a home in St. Martin. So I've seen prices in supermarkets triple. And then the supplier or the supermarket says, oh, the supplier charged me that much, so I have to pass the cost on to someone. The supplier has to sell to somebody. If we, the buyers, agree to buy from a supplier that is price gouging, we're engaging in that fraudulent activity and we're facilitating it. It's up to us to say no. The price is this. And in fact, one of the good things is there are price or data aggregators, companies around the world who we can turn to and say, hey, Minecraft, how much does this cost typically when we're not having a pandemic? And then you'll know how much you should pay. That's number one. Number two, suppliers know that their prices are can be a little bit elevated when there's a real need, but they also know that if they push it too far, nobody's going to buy. So that is where we need to focus our attention. If suppliers are providing prices that are outlandish, it's up to the buyers to say, we're not going to buy at this price. Unfortunately, in places like small island states where distribution is limited to a few, if the source of the buying, if the person importing is not saying no to those prices, then indeed those prices do get turned on to the local population who themselves can rarely afford to pay those kinds of prices. So in the end, there's a lot of legislation to be done around that, but also enforcement. Once again, without the enforcement, nothing happens. So investigating, reporting on price gouging, and this is where, again, we need technology. We need to have apps where people can log on and say, hey, I'm taking a picture of this price so that you can see, and this is the location where it is. And then governments have a responsibility to go in and prosecute. That's what should happen.
Wow.
I was just about to suggest, like, what you were explaining before sounds like we would need an advanced supply chain or something like that. I mean, we should be able to trace, we should be able to see how the price moves, and we should be able to actually see what the connections to all these nation states and all the actors are, and understand better who the stakeholders are, who is having connections where, who stakes what, and how the power actually shifts when we are in situations like that. And it's all possible if we have the data at hand, but right now it's so fragmented and so in so many different databases that it's almost impossible to gather and make sense out of what we are kind of dealing with. Not to mention that a lot of that data is not even available, and it's probably not going to be available for a while. I mean, yeah, this is mind-blowing. What you're actually mentioning, it triggers a lot of suggestions and ideas that we can observe in the industry already. That's amazing.
Anya, Transparency International has done a lot of work on this. People are aware, people in the open data space and in the citizen and civic tech space are aware of this. There's already, opportunities to report on some of these actions with very simple technology, messaging. If you have a phone and you're in a place where you're seeing price gouging, you should be able to take your phone, take a picture, and message your local news station. Peer pressure still works, particularly in these cases. You don't have to wait for the government to come and do something. You can do something. So we each have an individual responsibility to take action as well, because where we can't necessarily change things right away, we can have an impact on the long term. Every individual's role, particularly during this pandemic, is to identify, inform, educate, and advocate. We have 4 actions that we can take, each of us.
Let's
Identify,
inform, and go
educate,
ahead.
and advocate.
I love it.
I'm glad we have that on recording.
If we each take our responsibility seriously, I am confident that the lessons learned from this pandemic will take our societies to an entirely new level and will make us stronger and better, particularly when it comes to transparency and good governance. This is our chance, actually. Everyone who complains all the time about, oh, look at what's happening here and look at what this country is doing. This is our chance. This is not just a question of writing to your congressperson. This is our chance to use the tools at our disposal: writing, reading, webinars, podcasts, speaking, identify, inform, educate, and advocate for what's right, not just for you, but for everybody else. One thing we didn't talk about is the billions of dollars that have appeared out of nowhere from country resources that weren't available when it was time to help fight against, help refugees integrate or help create.
The scales are falling off on our global financial system and our financial, come on.
Exactly. It's amazing that when it's time to fund education or fund infrastructure or
where's it coming from?
Or environment, we don't have the funds, but all of a sudden billions of U.S.
trillions for the stock market.
Absolutely, have appeared to do bailouts all over the world.
Yeah.
And that is outlandish, and that's something that every citizen should be highly concerned about.
Yes, and I
it shows the priorities that we have, right?
It shows the priorities we have, but it also shows that when governments want to find the money, they can, and private sector too.
Absolutely. Oh my
this
God.
Is so
Magda,
powerful.
do you have a political party that I can sign up to today? Because I am signing up Magda Theodate for president. Okay? You all have a real governance leadership gap in the US there. They need to hear you. We need to hear more.
No, there are many bright minds, much brighter than mine.
Well,
my
I
humble
know there are
mind.
many bright minds,
but there are many people who have been leading this fight long before me. Today's my turn just to share it with a new audience, perhaps. But there has been work going on in the background for so long. Now that work needs to come to the forefront. Anya talked about databases being dispersed. Well, that's what blockchain was supposed to handle. But people have been holding back on blockchain because they're saying, oh, it's complicated. Oh, well, maybe we can't implement it. Oh, how will countries who are not as advanced do it? That's what blockchain was supposed to capture, and that's what civic tech, gov tech, open society, open
Anya Bly is the president of the Slovenian blockchain think tank.
Fantastic.
And is a blockchain lawyer and is part of DGov, distributed governance network and all of that.
So I'm preaching to the choir.
And we are working.
I know what you're talking about.
In fact, we're working on something, a couple of things that I would love to bring you into the conversations on, where we're combining the procurement and supply chain sort of knowledge with the blockchain, and we're working on that on another project. But I know you have to go, so just one last thing before you go, after I sign up to your political party and all of that. Are you tracking what countries are doing right now in respect of trade policies? If there are any COVID-19 responses? Well, of course, we're seeing the export bans. Are you tracking the non-tariff barriers that are being raised right now, and or any other policies that governments are putting in place across the globe? Anywhere? Are you?
Yeah, I am personally and as a professional who's interested in these matters, but I don't have the reach that a wider and institutional tracking would have. And that's what I'd like to see. I thought that an organization like UNCTAD would be doing that. And unfortunately, that's not been the case. So, and they have the resources to do that. And as you said, what I've seen, like in everyone else, is the export bans popping up all over the world. I think that's going to continue, and that's a dangerous precedent that we really have to watch very closely.
So we have to track and monitor
we
these
absolutely
things.
do. I have no doubt that that it's being done perhaps by CSOs and NGOs, but there's no question that it should be done at the institutional level, at the UN level, for example, because if you have an institution collecting that information, it has much more validity than Magda Theodate presenting it as an individual. So my interest as an individual is important, and I'm able to then flag it perhaps on an OpenGov platform. But in order for it to be properly captured and then acted upon by the powers that have the ability to act upon it, it really should be done at an institutional level. And I would advocate using this platform, that those listening from UNCTAD and UNCITRAL and other United Nations organizations who have the power
Absolutely.
and the funding to do this, step in and make sure that that's captured.
We were going to close, but I have to, come back at you on that. I mean, I absolutely think that building a database of COVID-19 policy response measures, why hasn't the UN done it yet? But I know some international organizations are starting to put things together within particular fields and all this sort of thing. What we have been doing on our end in the future law is that we've recognized, my God, we need to see this. And we need to make this happen if no one else is doing it. And we're talking about a meta level database, because we are seeing databases on human rights measures, on surveillance measures, on different niche areas, but a meta database bring it all together. We're not seeing it. And so one of the things we've started doing, we made a call, we've gotten about 30 something lawyers now working with us in over 5 continents, tracking and uploading it into a database. And we're talking with institutional partners to support the effort to create an open source database that academics, media, policymakers, all of us, advisors can go on, and we can track, we can do our comparative analyses, we can, cross-index that against the impacts on the ground chronologically and all of that. We just think it's a really important effort, and I hope that we might be able to reach out to you.
It would be my
that
pleasure,
effort.
Margaret. You already have a precedent for this, by the way. The World Health Organization has done a fantastic job tracking COVID and doing and mapping it and doing it digitally.
John Hopkins and all of that.
And John Hopkins.
Yeah. You know what? So we're seeing incredible resources.
Absolutely.
On the disease tracking, the deaths, the quantitative issues dealing with health. Incredible resources.
But not on the policy, and certainly not on the trade level. And what we need to do is see that same thing happening coming out of the World Trade Organization and the WE Forum, the World Economic Forum.
Can you help us to advocate for that? Can you?
I help you, and I will help you in any way possible. And absolutely, if I can, I will. There's no question about it, because we all stand for the same thing, making sure that people's lives are saved, and that what we're living through today will not happen again, and that the failings that we're seeing at the level of the governments will not repeat themselves either. Cool. So thank you for the opportunity to comment today. Yeah. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, love.
Yeah,
I feel fed. I feel fired up. I feel ready to go, right? Yeah, to identify, inform, educate, and advocate. Just a real blessing and a pleasure to have you on this show.
Thank you. And a pleasure to meet you, and pleasure to be with you, Margaret. I appreciate it.